Before looking at the plagues individually, it's worth highlighting a curious phenomenon at this point. I remember hearing of someone who developed some kind of obsession with a 1970s book movie album called Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which was demonically inspired. When the demon that had gained a foothold in the person's life through the music was being expelled and it began manifesting, the person took on the characteristics of a seagull. He began flapping and squawking like a bird. From this example and others, it appears that when human beings create an idol or god associated with something, a real demon is assigned to the position to become the object of their affections. So in a sense, the god becomes real, but only in that it is a demonic entity. This makes a certain amount of sense. When Lucifer was trying to get the angels to follow him in his rebellion, remember the motivation he gave them was that he could give them a higher position in his kingdom than they had in God's. Lucifer told them that he would give them a position whereby they would be worshipped as gods themselves, and would have positions of power and prominence. These fallen angels who accepted his offer will therefore want to be worshipped like gods, and it probably explains from a spiritual perspective why polytheism became rife. Behind each of the thousands, if not millions of gods or goddesses are demons who want to be worshipped, and so take on roles whereby men will venerate them. But remembering the pyramid structure, there are more powerful ones and less powerful ones in Satan's organized kingdom. Keep that in mind now as we look at the 10 plagues God sent upon the Egyptians to force them into letting his chosen people go, because what we'll find is that with each plague, he was in fact taking the opportunity to show his authority over their demonic gods. For example, the first plague that God visited upon the Egyptians was to turn the water of the Nile and indeed all the water in Egypt to blood. This was not some random whim, a magic trick to wow and amaze Pharaoh. It was a calculated sniper shot aimed directly at the Egyptian god of the Nile, Hapi. God was showing Egypt that their gods were powerless against him. But much more than this, the show of superiority was primarily for the benefit of the Jews. Still new in their relationship, God wanted to show them that they could trust him, that he really was the true God, and that he had complete superiority over the Egyptian form of the Babylonian gods that they were surrounded with. There were also several other gods that would also have been shown up by this miracle. Although Hapi was considered to be the spirit of the Nile, they believed a god called Khnum was its guardian. Some also believed that the Nile was the bloodstream of the god Osiris, and therefore it was fitting that God actually turned it into blood. All these were completely feeble in the presence of Almighty God. The second plague was an infestation of frogs. Again, this was not arbitrary, but a show of God's superiority over Heket, goddess of fertility, water, and renewal. The third plague was lice from the dust of the earth, and this was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian god Geb, god of the earth. The fourth plague was swarms, most probably of flies, and this was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian god Khepri. He had the head of a fly and was the god of creation, movement of the sun, and rebirth. The fifth plague was the death of cattle and livestock. This was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Hathor was originally worshipped in the form of a cow, and she was later represented as a woman with the head of a cow and then finally with just a human head. She was the symbolic mother of Pharaoh. The sixth plague was boils and sores, and this was God's show of superiority over Isis. Isis is the goddess of medicine and peace. It would also have been an affront to Imhotep, Serapis, and Thoth, the gods of knowledge, healing, intelligence, and medical learning. Notice how Isis is depicted with a tower on her head, like the crown Semiramis wore. This is because Isis was the direct Egyptian equivalent. The seventh plague was hail, and this was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian goddess of the sky, Nut. It was also an affront to Shu, the wind god, and Horus, the hawk-headed sky god. Isis and Seth supposedly protected the crops, but the burned fields were a testimony to their impotence in the face of Almighty God. The eighth plague was locusts sent from the sky. This was primarily God's show of superiority over the god of crops, Seth. It was also an affront to Nepri, the god of grain, Ermutet, the goddess of childbirth and crops, Isis once more, and Thermuthis, the goddess of fertility and harvest. The ninth plague was 3 days of complete darkness. This was God's show of superiority over the sun god Ra. Once again, the various other Egyptian gods were powerless as well. Notice the serpent around the sun in this picture. You may have noticed that Egyptian pharaohs also wore headpieces with serpents at the front. Finally, the 10th plague sent by God was the death of all the firstborn sons. God says in Exodus 12:12 that this plague was a plague of judgment on all the gods of Egypt, and would show their total inability to protect their subjects from the hands of Almighty God. In the face of unparalleled tragedy, all the gods of Egypt were silent. Meshchenet, the goddess who presided at the birth of children; Min, the god of procreation; Isis, the goddess of fertility; Selket, the guardian of life; Renenutet, the cobra goddess and guardian of Pharaoh. It was also an attack on the god that was considered to be the greatest of them all in Egypt, Pharaoh himself. It should also be remembered that this plague was the exact thing Pharaoh had tried to do to the Jewish people. He had commanded that all Jewish males be killed the moment they are born, and so God turned that back upon the Egyptians. The curse Pharaoh pronounced on the Jews bounced back upon himself. This is a common thing with God. The evil people intend to do to the Jews, God turns back on them, thus fulfilling the promise that he had given to Abraham that he would bless those that bless Israel and curse those who cursed them. The number 10 represents completeness in pagan numerology, and so these plagues combined indicated the completeness of God's power over these false, demonic gods and goddesses. God isn't done showing his supremacy over idols, by the way. In Revelation we read that at the end of time, when the 6th seal is opened, the sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth. So at the end of time, God will show his supremacy over the sun, the moon and the stars, which would be a symbolic picture of his supremacy over Baal as the sun god, Asherah as the moon goddess, and the multitudes of smaller demonic gods in the form of the stars. As far as our study goes, you can forget all the names for the Egyptian gods we've just been reading about, but remember Osiris, Isis and Horus. These are the primary Egyptian forms of the Babylonian trinity, Baal, Asherah and Tammuz.